She hid her face and cried by the tracks, convinced this was the end. But a quiet cowboy stepped out of the shadows and said, "You're coming with me tonight." It was Dodge City, Kansas. October 17th, 1884. The air tasted like gunpowder and coal smoke as the midnight train screamed down the tracks, a mechanical monster cutting through the dark. On the edge of those rails sat Clara Jameson. She was only 21, but she felt 100 years old, her shoulders shaking under a shawl that couldn't keep out the cold. Or the fear. Her face was buried in her hands, trying to smother the sobs. She'd just run barefoot from the Black Spade Saloon, a place where her stepfather's gambling debts were about to be paid with her life. He'd tried to sell her, to settle his score with the saloon's owner, a man with cold eyes and colder hands. She had fought, clawed, and fled into the night with nothing but a torn dress and the sound of their laughter chasing her. Now, the train's whistle was the only company she had. A lonely sound for a lonely girl. But then, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the train station. A figure emerged. He was a cowboy, his boots silent on the dirt, his hat pulled low. His voice was steady, calm, and it cut right through her panic. "You don't belong here." Clara lifted her head. Her tear-streaked face was a pale mask in the flickering lantern light. Her eyes were wide, red-rimmed, searching the man's hidden face for a threat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that seemed loud enough to give her away. She knew they were looking for her. Her stepfather, his boots heavy with whiskey and rage, would be scouring this town until he found his property. And she was the property. She had run from the stink of cheap liquor and the greedy men who thought a piece of paper gave them the right to own her. She'd run until the train tracks appeared like a line drawn between a life of slavery and a life of... what? Hope had no shape out here. It was just a cold, dark horizon. Her body sagged against a wooden post, her spirit broken. And that's when she felt it. A change in the air. A silence that wasn't empty, but watchful. That's when she saw him. He stood a few feet away, tall and completely still. The brim of his hat hid his eyes, but the hard line of his jaw told her he'd seen storms worse than this. His voice came again, low and quiet, but it hit her with the force of a physical blow. "You can't stay here." She tried to answer, to ask who he was, why he was here when the rest of the world had looked away. But the words were stuck in her throat, tangled in fear and mistrust. All she could do was stare. He didn't step closer, but his presence felt like a wall between her and the men hunting her. She'd never seen him before, but something in his stillness told her he wasn't like them. Still, her mind replayed the horror of the saloon. Rough hands dragging her, men laughing at her terror, her stepfather's voice, sharp as a razor, telling her she was just a coin to be spent. The night seemed to echo with their approaching footsteps. The train could be her escape, a ticket to anywhere else. But the thought of climbing aboard with no money, no plan, and no one to turn to was just another kind of terror. Her gaze drifted back to the cowboy. He hadn't moved. He just waited, as if he could see the war raging inside her. He hadn't said much, but his presence had changed everything. One choice, one step, and her life would never be the same. The cowboy, Elias, shifted his weight, his shadow stretching long and thin in the lantern light. His silence was heavier than any words, and it held Clara pinned in place. She was torn between a lifetime of learned fear and a single fragile thread of hope. She studied him, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Her hands twisted the fabric of her dress, the only shield she had left. There was no obvious threat in him. His coat was worn, his hat dusty, but the way he stood, the way he watched her, pierced through the darkness. It gave her a feeling she hadn't felt since she was a little girl, before her father died and her mother married a monster. The feeling of safety. Her lips parted, a tiny, soundless gasp escaping. He tilted his head, a slight motion. He wasn't impatient. He wasn't demanding. He was just waiting, as if he had all the time in the world, and he was giving it all to her. The train screamed again, a final desperate call. For a second, she wished she could just dissolve into the night, vanish onto that train and ride until the world forgot her name. But a whisper in her soul warned her that freedom without protection was just a bigger cage. Elias straightened up, the leather of his gun belt creaking faintly. His voice was deeper this time, more urgent. "Trouble's coming," he said. "You know that, don't you?" The words sent a blade of ice down her spine, because she did know. She could feel it in the wind. She could see it in the rage-filled eyes of her stepfather in her mind. Why did this stranger care? Why was he the only one in this whole miserable town who hadn't turned away? The questions piled up, but she couldn't speak. It felt foolish to even think that someone, anyone, would choose to stand with her. He reached into his coat, and her body tensed, ready to bolt. But his hand came out slow, empty, and open. It wasn't a threat. It was a gesture of peace, a sign that in this moment he meant her no harm, only a choice. Her eyes burned with a fresh wave of tears, but they refused to fall. She was trapped. Trapped between running into the empty, dangerous night alone or stepping toward a man who was a complete mystery. But the way he looked at her, it made her feel seen. Not as a piece of property, not as a debt to be paid, but as a person, a soul worth saving. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was alive, thrumming with a silent promise. And though she still couldn't find her voice, the trembling in her hands began to subside. Her breathing eased. Hope, fragile but real, started to push back the fear. Elias didn't move. He just stood there, letting the truth of the moment settle between them. He didn't have to say he would protect her. His eyes, fixed on hers, said it for him. The night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her decision. When he finally moved his hand forward, it wasn't a command. It was an invitation. His palm was steady, his fingers open. An offer of help, with no strings attached. Or so she thought. Her gaze flicked from his hand to the train tracks, 2 iron ribbons stretching into forever. They could be her path to freedom, or the place she finally died. The train's whistle cut through the air one last time, a sharp, mournful sound that echoed her own doubt. Escape was dangerous. But staying was a death sentence. Her eyes went back to his face. The shadows hid so much, but they couldn't hide the conviction in his gaze. He'd said only 4 words, "You're coming with me," but they had hit her with the force of a sacred oath. There was no greed in his voice, no hunger, just certainty. Her fingers unclenched from her dress. The voice of her past screamed at her, reminding her of every time she'd trusted and been betrayed. But a new voice, a quieter one, whispered that if she ran now, she would be running forever. He didn't waver. His hand remained outstretched, a patient offer in the cold night air. It was a kindness she had forgotten existed. Her vision blurred. Her heart pounded, a wild bird trapped in her chest. She lifted her own hand. It shook, a leaf in a storm, but it rose. Her fingertips brushed against his palm. The contact sent a jolt through her, a current of warmth that wasn't about fear. It was about something else. Something that felt like an anchor in a raging sea. His grip was firm, but gentle. A silent promise that he would not let go. His face was still unreadable beneath the brim of his hat, but she could feel the strength in his hand flowing into her, calming the storm inside. For a long moment, they just stood there, connected by that single point of contact. The world faded away. Then, he gave a small nod. The decision was made. Clara swallowed hard, her voice still lost to her. But her silence was no longer about fear. It was an agreement. He drew her slowly to her feet. The train tracks behind her seemed to recede into the darkness, no longer a temptation or a threat. just a part of a life she was leaving behind. She was stepping into a future she couldn't see, with a man she didn't know. And as the lantern light swung, it illuminated his wrist, and she saw it. A brand. A small, dark spade burned into his skin. Her blood ran cold. It was the symbol of the Black Spade Saloon, the very place her stepfather had tried to sell her. This man wasn't a savior. He wasn't a random stranger. He was one of them. He tightened his grip on her hand, pulling her away from the tracks just as the first shouts echoed from the edge of town. The voices were low and harsh, carried on the wind. Clara's chest seized. She knew those voices, her stepfather, and the men who worked for the saloon, the men who wore the same spade brand that was seared into the flesh of the man holding her hand. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up her throat. He wasn't saving her. He was collecting her. He was the one her stepfather had sold her to. She tried to pull her hand back, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. But his grip was like iron. He didn't even look at her. He just tugged her forward, his pace quickening. His silence was no longer a comfort. It was a threat. He knew the danger was coming because he had brought it with him. The moonlight lit a narrow path through the tall prairie grass, but every shadow looked like a monster. Every rustle of leaves sounded like another man closing in. "Where are you taking me?" she finally choked out, the words raw and broken. He didn't answer. He just pulled her off the path, down into a dry creek bed that snaked away from the town, a dark hidden scar on the land. The smell of smoke and whiskey seemed to cling to the air, and Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She could hear them clearly now. A dog barked, and then came the metallic click-clack of guns being checked. They were hunting her, and her protector was leading them right to her. She stumbled, her knees giving out. He caught her, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against him. He was strong, far stronger than he looked. He turned his head, his profile a hard silhouette against the pale sky. His voice was low, but it wasn't steady anymore. It was laced with something else, something that sounded like frustration. "They won't touch you," he growled. But the words were meaningless now. The sound of boots on gravel was getting closer. Too close. They were going to be caught, and this man's lie was going to cost her everything. The prairie, which had seemed like a symbol of freedom moments ago, now felt like a trap, its tall grass ready to suffocate her. He pulled her deeper into the shadows, his movements quick and sure. He moved like a predator, not a protector. Clara's mind raced. This was a trap. Her stepfather hadn't just sold her, he'd arranged this whole thing. This cowboy was here to make sure she didn't get away. The chase was just for show. The voices were right behind them now, cursing, shouting her name. The sound of it, long and cruel, made her flinch. She was nothing more than an animal to them. Elias's hand squeezed hers, a silent command to keep moving. They plunged deeper into the wilderness, the darkness a thick, smothering blanket. She knew this was all borrowed time. Any second, a hand would grab her shoulder, and the game would be over. Suddenly, Elias stopped. He pulled her behind a cluster of large rocks, pushing her down until she was crouching in the dirt. He knelt beside her, his body shielding hers. He put a finger to his lips, his eyes finally visible in the faint starlight. They weren't cold or cruel. They were sharp, focused, and filled with an intensity that startled her. The footsteps grew louder, pounding the earth just yards from their hiding place. "Spread out!" her stepfather yelled. "She couldn't have gone far. The boss wants her tonight." Clara held her breath, tears streaming silently down her face. The boss. That had to be Elias. She risked a glance at him, but he wasn't looking at her. He was peering through a crack in the rocks, his jaw tight. He slowly drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being pulled back deafeningly loud in the silence. He wasn't going to hand her over. He was going to fight them. But why? If he was one of them, why would he fight his own men? The questions spun in her head, a dizzying cyclone of confusion and terror. One of the men passed so close to their hiding spot that she could smell the stale whiskey on his breath. Her entire body trembled, but Elias's hand rested on her shoulder, a heavy, steady weight that kept her from screaming. The man moved on. The footsteps faded as the group spread out, continuing their search deeper into the prairie. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the wind and the frantic beating of her own heart. Finally, Elias let out a slow breath. He holstered his pistol and looked down at her. "We need to move," he whispered, "before they circle back." "Who are you?" she whispered back, her voice shaking. She pointed a trembling finger at the brand on his wrist. "You're one of them." A flicker of something, regret, maybe, passed through his eyes. He didn't deny it. He just shook his head. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Now come on. We don't have time for this." He stood and pulled her to her feet. His urgency was real, his fear for their safety palpable. But his brand was also real. The men hunting her were his men. Nothing made sense. He started moving again, pulling her along, but this time Clara dug in her heels. "No," she said, her voice finding a sliver of strength. "Not until you tell me what's going on. Why are you helping me if you're one of them?" He stopped and turned to face her fully. The moonlight cast deep shadows across his face, making him look dangerous and haunted. "Because my boss wants you," he said, his voice flat. "And I have orders to bring you in, but my orders are to bring you in alive, and preferably unharmed." He glanced in the direction her stepfather had gone. "Your stepfather and his friends, they don't care about the unharmed part." The blood drained from Clara's face. So this was the truth. He wasn't a savior. He was just a delivery man, a hired hand sent to collect a package, and he was simply trying to keep the merchandise from getting damaged before it reached its final owner. She was still just a thing, an object to be bought and sold. The fragile hope that had sparked to life within her died, turning to ash in her chest. She looked at him, at the gun on his hip and the brand on his wrist, and saw him for what he was. Just another link in the chain that was about to be fastened around her neck for good. The only difference was, his cage had a gentler door. He saw the look in her eyes, and his expression hardened. "It's better than the alternative," he said quietly. "Now are you coming, or do you want to wait for them to find you?" He didn't have to say anything else. She knew what her stepfather was capable of. She knew what those other men wanted. This man, Elias, was a monster. But he was the lesser of two evils. With a heart made of lead, she nodded. And for the second time that night, she followed him into the darkness, not toward freedom, but toward a new and unknown prison. Her legs ached, every muscle screaming in protest, but she followed him. The prairie seemed to stretch on forever, a dark, empty sea under a blanket of cold stars. The last echo of the train's whistle had long since faded, and with it, any dream of escape. She was a prisoner, walking toward her own cage. The man, Elias, hadn't spoken another word. He just moved ahead of her, a silent, relentless guide. He moved with a confidence that told her he knew this land, that he knew exactly where he was going. And that certainty was more terrifying than any threat. He was taking her home, to his boss, the man who had bought her. Her tears had dried, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in her chest. She was done with crying. Crying hadn't saved her from her stepfather, and it wouldn't save her now. All that was left was a bitter, burning anger. Anger at her stepfather for selling her, anger at this man for capturing her, and anger at herself for that one brief, stupid moment when she had allowed herself to feel hope. She glanced at him, at the steady line of his shoulders and the way he held his head, always scanning the horizon. There was nothing gentle about him now. He was a professional, a man doing a job, and she was the job. She wondered what kind of man his boss was. Was he old? Cruel? Would he be better or worse than the men in the saloon? It didn't matter. He had bought her, and that made him a monster too. After what felt like hours, he finally slowed. Up ahead, nestled in a small, hidden valley, was a faint orange glow. A campfire. As they drew closer, she could see the dark shape of a small, isolated cabin. A horse nickered softly from a makeshift corral. This was it. This was her prison. Her feet felt like lead. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to do anything but take another step toward that cabin. But where would she go? They were miles from town, in the middle of nowhere. Running now would just be a slower way to die. Elias stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned to her. In the firelight, she could see his face more clearly. He was younger than she'd thought, maybe not yet 30. He had a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, and his eyes were a startlingly light shade of gray like a stormy sky. They were tired eyes, filled with a weariness that went bone deep. "We're here," he said, his voice flat. He gestured toward the cabin. "He's waiting inside." Clara's heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of her chest. She couldn't move. Her body was frozen, locked in place by a terror so profound it stole the air from her lungs. This was the moment her life truly ended. Elias watched her, his expression unreadable. He sighed, a soft, weary sound. "Look," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I know what you're thinking, but you need to trust me." She let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Trust you? You have the brand of the man who bought me on your arm. You lied to me. You dragged me out here to deliver me like a piece of mail. Why in God's name would I trust you?" He looked down at the brand on his wrist, and for a second, she saw a flash of self-loathing in his eyes. He looked back at her, and his gaze was so intense it felt like he was looking right into her soul. "Because the man in that cabin," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "isn't the man who owns the Black Spade Saloon." Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. "What? Then who is he?" "He's my brother," Elias said, "and we're the ones who are going to save you." The words hung in the air, a possibility so unbelievable that Clara couldn't process it. His brother? Save her? It had to be another trick, another lie designed to get her to walk into that cabin without a fight. But the look in his eyes, it was desperate. He was pleading with her to believe him. "I don't understand," she stammered. "Our father owned a small ranch just north of here," Elias explained, his words coming in a rush. "Your stepfather, William, wanted it. He cheated my father in a card game, left him with nothing. The shame of it killed him. William took the land, sold it, and used the money to open that saloon with his new partner." He took a step closer, his gray eyes burning with a cold fire. "My brother and I, we swore we'd get revenge. We've been working to destroy William from the inside. I took a job at the saloon, even took their brand just to get close to him. We were building a case against him, for cheating, for everything. And then we heard what he was planning to do to you." He shook his head, a look of disgust on his face. "We couldn't let that happen, but we couldn't just walk in and take you. He would have had you hunted down as a runaway. So we created a fiction. My brother, posing as a wealthy cattle baron, made William an offer for you. A debt that was too good for a greedy snake like him to refuse. He took the bait. As far as your stepfather knows, I was just sent to collect what he owes." Clara's knees felt weak. She reached out and braced herself against a tree, the rough bark digging into her palm. It was an elaborate story, an impossible one. But it explained everything. It explained why he'd fought his own men, why he was so determined to get her away from them, why he looked at his own brand with such hatred. "So, you didn't buy me?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat. No, Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. We paid to set you free. Just then, the cabin door opened. A man stepped out, his silhouette framed by the warm light from within. He was taller than Elias, and he held a rifle in his hands. He looked from Elias to Clara, his expression grim. Took you long enough, he said to Elias, his voice a low growl. Then his eyes softened as they landed on Clara. Ma'am, he said, nodding his head respectfully. My name is Jacob. I apologize for the theatrics. Please come inside. You're safe now. Clara looked from Jacob to Elias, her heart torn between a lifetime of suspicion and the incredible truth of his story. She looked at Elias's outstretched hand, the same hand she had taken once in fear. This time, when she looked at it, she didn't see a captor. She saw a man who had damned himself to save her. Slowly, her own hand rose to meet his. And when their fingers touched, it wasn't a transaction. It was a promise. She had been bought and sold and betrayed her whole life. But tonight, two strangers had paid the highest price of all, not to own her, but to give her back the one thing she thought she had lost forever: her freedom. As she stepped into the warm, safe light of the cabin, she knew the fight wasn't over. Her stepfather was still out there. But for the first time, she wasn't alone. And she wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor. And soon, she would be a part of their revenge. The cabin was small but clean, filled with the comforting smell of wood smoke and coffee. Jacob, Elias's brother, was a man carved from the same hard rock, but his eyes held a kindness that Elias kept hidden. He handed Clara a tin cup of steaming coffee, his large, calloused hands gentle. I'm sorry for the deception, Miss Jameson, Jacob said, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. It was the only way we could get you away from William, without him sending the law after you. As far as he knows, you're with a ruthless cattle baron who won't take kindly to being disturbed. Clara wrapped her cold hands around the warm cup, the heat seeping into her bones. He'll figure it out eventually, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He'll come looking for his money. For me. Let him come, Elias said from the doorway, his voice hard as flint. He had been standing watch, his gaze sweeping the dark prairie. That's the point. We're not running. We're drawing him into a trap. Clara looked between the two brothers. They were so different. Jacob was the steady oak, solid and dependable. Elias was the storm, coiled energy and silent intensity. But they shared the same fire in their eyes, a burning need for justice. What is your plan? She asked. Jacob pulled out a map and spread it on the simple wooden table. William is greedy, but he's not stupid. He'll get suspicious when his cattle baron never shows up in town. He'll come back to this area, looking for answers. And when he does, we'll be waiting. He pointed to a narrow canyon marked on the map. He thinks he owns this land. We're going to use his pride against him. The plan was simple and deadly. They would leak a false rumor in town about a new gold strike in that canyon. William, whose greed always outweighed his caution, would be unable to resist investigating. He would ride into the canyon, expecting to find riches. Instead, he would find the two sons of the man he had destroyed. And her. What do you need me to do? Clara asked, her voice steady. The fear that had lived in her for years was being burned away by a new, hotter emotion. A desire for retribution. Elias turned from the door, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected her to be afraid, to want to hide. He hadn't expected her to want to fight. You've done enough, he said. You should stay here, where it's safe. No, Clara said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. He took my home. He tried to sell my life. This is my fight too. I'm not going to hide while you risk your lives for me. Tell me what to do. The brothers exchanged a look. In that single glance, an understanding passed between them. Clara Jameson was not the fragile, broken girl they had rescued from the tracks. She was a survivor, forged in fire, and her will was as strong as tempered steel. Jacob nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "You'll be our secret weapon." Over the next 2 days they prepared. Jacob and Elias taught her to shoot, not just a pistol but a rifle. Her hands, once accustomed to mending and baking, grew steady holding the heavy weight of the steel. She was a natural, her aim true. The quiet focus she had used to survive years of her stepfather's cruelty now served her well. She learned to load, fire, and reload until the motions were second nature. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was becoming a soldier in her own war. Elias watched her, a silent, intense observer. He said little, but she could feel his respect growing. The brand on his wrist was a constant reminder of the sacrifice he'd made, the dark world he had willingly entered for the sake of his family's honor, and for her. She found herself watching him, too, intrigued by the quiet, haunted man who said so little, but felt so much. She saw the pain he carried, the weight of the past that pressed down on him, and she recognized it, because she carried it too. On the third morning, Jacob rode into town to plant the rumor of the gold strike. Clara and Elias were left alone at the cabin. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. "Why didn't you tell me the truth at the tracks?" Clara finally asked, breaking the stillness. Elias didn't look at her. He was cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and economical. "You were scared," he said, his voice low. "If I'd told you a long, complicated story about revenge, you would have run. You needed something simple, a choice between two dangers. I made myself the lesser danger." "You lied to me," she said, but there was no accusation in her voice, only a need to understand. He stopped his work and finally met her gaze. His gray eyes were filled with a raw honesty that took her breath away. "Yes," he said. "I did. It's what I've been doing for 2 years. Lying, cheating, becoming the kind of man I despise, all to get close to William. Sometimes to fight monsters, you have to become one yourself." "You're not a monster, Elias," she said softly. A sad, bitter smile touched his lips. "You haven't seen what I've done," he whispered. Before she could answer, they heard the sound of a horse approaching at a gallop. It was Jacob. He burst into the clearing, his face grim. "He took the bait," Jacob said, swinging down from his horse. "But he's not coming alone. He's rounded up a dozen men from the saloon. He thinks he's going to clear out a gold claim, but he's ready for a war. 12 men, against the 3 of them. The odds were impossible." "The plan still holds," Elias said, his voice calm, but his eyes were blazing. He looked at Clara. "It's not too late to back out. We can still get you away from here." Clara picked up her rifle. She looked at the 2 brothers who had risked everything for her, at the man who had worn the brand of his enemy to get justice. She thought of her stepfather, of the years of fear and the final, ultimate betrayal. "I'm not running," she said. And in her voice, there was no fear. There was only the cold, hard certainty of a coming storm. The trap was set. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and the battle for Redemption Canyon was about to begin. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what we have coming next is something you won't want to miss.